Hi, I'm Doug Ballinger. I'm Logan's dad. Welcome to another episode of Logan's Voice, a podcast where we speak the names of those we've lost, break the silence around grief, and advocate for change in the wake of unimaginable loss. Today's episode is deeply personal. I'm joined by two extraordinary women, Jamie and Simone, bereavement specialists with Arkansas Hospice, who became my lifeline in the early days after Logan died. We met during the height of the pandemic when the world was shutting down and grief support had to go virtual. Through a Zoom screen, these two women helped create a safe space where I could begin to process the pain of losing my son. There were no roadmaps for grieving during a global crisis. Isolation, fear, and confusion were everywhere. But Jamie and Simone showed up week after week with compassion, understanding, and wisdom that helped me survive that first year. I honestly don't know how I would have started my grief journey without them. They saw me not just as a grieving dad, but as someone worthy of hope, healing, and community. Today, we're going to talk about what it means to support someone through traumatic loss and the ongoing need for spaces where people can simply show up and be seen. Jamie and Simone, thank you so much for being here. And more importantly, thank you for being there when I needed you most in the beginning of my grief.
Oh,
Aw.
well, we are so happy to be here on Logan's Voice today and continuing to be connected with you.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolute. Well, yes, and thank you for asking us to do this. I'm just so proud of you
Mm.
for being Logan's voice now, and all the things that have happened over the past 5 years to bring you to this point, and how you continue to reframe and navigate your grief and your healing daily. And thank you for trusting us 5 years ago, when you were new in
Yes.
your grief and you needed support. So thank you for letting us be your companion.
Absolutely. There was no way I could have made it this far without the two of you. Um, can each of you maybe share a little bit about what brought you into the work of grief counseling and support?
Simone, you go first.
Okay, sure. So I kind of always had a natural inclination to be with people at end of life. And I decided when I was in eighth grade that I was going to be a funeral director. And there was no changing that course. And so everything I did was that. My undergrad degree is in funeral science. And with that, like, I realized how much I loved supporting grieving people. And so that just continued to morph and grow and change through the years. And I ended up getting this wonderful job of being a bereavement specialist with Arkansas Hospice. And, it's just my niche. I've continued on with my education, and I'm now a therapist, and grief is my specialty.
That's awesome.
And
And are you are you do you have any focus on traumatic grief or do you separate that?
Yes, I absolutely do. I am a trauma certified therapist, and there's definitely that aspect of traumatic grief for sure.
Thank you. Jamie?
well, I came to this work a little bit differently. I'm a bit of a Heinz 57 with my background, doing a variety of things and changing my major a couple of times, but that's okay because a lot of us don't end up doing professionally, what we end up getting our degrees in. But I was in the corporate world for a long time, but I have always had a tender heart. And I've always been a bit of an empath, I think, and even at a young age. So, the gathering storm of me feeling a calling in my soul to do something different, happened for me in 2003, and by a set of circumstances, which is too long to share right now, I ended up doing a chaplain residency at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. They have a clinical pastoral education program that I was very fortunate to spend a year as a chaplain resident. And in that year, I learned about ministry, what true ministry is. I learned about the concept of being a non-anxious presence. I learned about, how to sit with people, how to be with people, how to not fix people. So a real foundation and groundwork that created a love for me, not only in being a non-anxious presence with people, but it then led me to working for 10 years with the Arkansas Regional Organ Recovery Agency, helping families make end-of-life decisions about donation when their loved one wasn't going to survive a brain injury. About 98% of the time, it's a brain injury. Sometimes you could get to donation by other ways, but through like a stroke or things like that. Anyway, so I spent 10 years working in traumatic death, which really helped prepare me for the work I do now. And I left that field in 2014 and began my work in hospice. And it has prepared me to work with families in a way that, because even though it is a hospice death and therefore not unexpected, there is absolutely trauma involved at times with these families, not only in what they may see or perceive at death, the guilt that sometimes accompanies someone dying, there can be trauma in that. But in that span of time, since 2003 to now, I have become a certified grief counselor, a certified thanatologist, and a certified end-of-life doula.
That is amazing. Both of your stories are just amazing. I remember those early days of our support group on Zoom, and what do you recall from those early days of our Zoom support group when the pandemic had us all locked down and isolated?
Well, I would say, first of all, like, we didn't know what we were doing as far as providing support via Zoom, telegrief is what we ended up calling it. But we were, along with every other person in the world, like, trying to figure out how to do everything virtually. And it did work well, though. What we had set up, and I think we could have just as good a connection, heartfelt connection with people over a computer, even, that we weren't in the same room, we were still connecting in those same ways. And so we just realized, this works, and people needed grief counseling. Like, it wasn't available. Your normal supports were not available. Your ability to have funeral services and ritual and have people come and recognize you, in your grief and support you, like, all those things were taken away. So my opinion of the support group at that time when you joined was that it was more needed than ever, because people were needing those things that were all just taken away because of the pandemic. And, we did quite a few support groups more often than we do now, simply because there were no other connections for people who were grieving.
There was a real need, and I agree with you, Simone. And what I remember is, and especially in those early days, we had 8 or 10 people attending. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, Simone weekly. And I, weekly. And, Simone and I doing the group together, I think was necessary, because it allowed us to kind of tag team if need be. So we had a rule that if someone logged off from the call or their screen went blank or something, one of us would continue on with the group, making sure that, kind of keeping things moving forward and everybody having time to share and, really facilitating the group, while the other person would quietly check on the person who went off the radar. So, because, things, they might get triggered or they might get sad or They might need to go to the bathroom. I mean, we never knew, but it was, I think, imperative that, especially in those early days, that there were two of us that were monitoring and staying sharp to the needs of everyone in the group.
It
Mm-hmm.
it
Yes.
was a fabulous format. And I've just got to let you both know that through my work with Hope Movement Coalition and being in such a rural state that we're in, people are dying from overdose and fentanyl deaths all over the state, all over the country, really. And we launched a Zoom support group modeled after what you two ladies were doing.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
wow.
Such a
That's
needed thing. Yeah.
I'm
it
one of the
is.
You're doing
facilitators,
such
and
amazing work, Doug.
thank you. I'm one of the facilitators. I have another facilitator that lives in Northwest Arkansas. She's also on the executive board of Hope Movement, and her name is Jenny Neville. And we do the same thing, and we read basically the same rules, for lack of a better term, that you guys used in the beginning,
Yeah.
where if you're going to leave for some reason, give us a thumbs up, let us know you're okay. If not, one of us
Yeah.
is going to call you. And
Yeah.
it has worked out very well so far. Um,
Oh,
let's get
Grasshopper.
yes. Oh, grasshopper. Um, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of grief support. What does it really mean to hold space for someone in grief?
Well, I'll start with this
yeah.
one.
Okay.
As I think one of the biggest misconceptions about grief that we definitely get on our soapbox about is that grief is not an illness. Grief is a normal response to loss. Therefore, there is nothing to fix. And I think the misperception in society, because we are a world of doers and we are a world of fixers. So I think one of the very first tenets of grief, as it were, is that when we speak with people and when we enter into that space with people, that our goal is not to fix anyone. Our goal is to listen and support, to provide resources and tools as needed, to listen to their stories and to be. And, one of the things that happens very frequently in grief, and I know, Doug, that you can speak to this, is there's an expectation that we are meant to, get over the loss, that we're allowed, a little bit of time to have a funeral and, eat the casseroles and answer the phone calls and write the thank you notes. And then we're supposed to box it up and put it on a shelf and turn a corner. And we know that's not true. And so people begin feeling, those early days, there's all this support and they're surrounded. And then all of a sudden, the kids go home or everybody goes back to work. And the expectation is there that somehow you're supposed to do something, and you might stop talking about your grief because you get the sometimes subtle, sometimes not impression that people don't want to hear the story anymore. We're big on using the term mutual pretense, where mom doesn't tell the kids how she's hurting because she doesn't want to worry them. The kids don't talk about dad because they don't want to upset mom. When in reality, that's the sacred space that everyone can enter into together where, real healing can happen. So I think a lot of what we do is assuring people that, first of all, wherever they are in their grief, I believe is right where they're supposed to be. And then when it's time to make a shift, the shift comes either because they're ready or because their discomfort is bigger than their comfort and they want to make the next step in whatever that way means. And just normalizing grief and assuring people that things like, I don't know why I walked into a room, or, we call it grief brain, or I saw someone I've known for 30 years and I couldn't remember her name, things like that. So to me, one of the very first things is meeting people where they are, allowing them to be where they are, and assuring them that there is one person whose sole purpose and focus is to listen to their story as many times as they want or need to tell it, and be a companion with them on their journey and the ways that it changes.
I absolutely agree. Simone, do
Well,
you have
and I don't
anything
know
you
that
want to add?
yeah, I don't know that I can add anything to that. I mean, like, she's got it all.
She
But
does.
holding space is not always easy for people. That would be the other thing that I would say, is that some people really struggle with that because they do have that tendency to want to fix it. We want to fix it to make the person feel better, and we want to also fix it because sometimes, like, we're so uncomfortable with the
Right.
feeling. And when you are that person that in that space, it's hard to hold space for the other person. We don't want the person who is grieving to end up comforting us,
Right.
you know. Yeah.
To
And that
take on the
happens.
responsibility. Yeah, and it does
Right.
happen. And one of the number one questions that people ask me when I'm talking with someone is, they say, I don't know what to say when someone asks me how I'm doing, because it doesn't feel genuine to say I'm okay. But we do say that because it makes the person asking, it relieves them to a certain degree. And I always tell people to in however they want to phrase it, to basically come up with, thank you so much for asking. I'm doing the best I can right now. And when I tell people that, and when we help them figure out grief language, because grief does have its own language, they're relieved because they feel like I can say something that feels genuine. And I don't feel like I'm lying, and I don't feel like I'm having to placate the person who's asking. And that's the way that society also works, is that it ends up being the responsibility of the grieving person to make other people feel okay.
And, as a grieving parent, one of the things that I find most comforting is when people listen to me talk about Logan, or they ask
Absolutely.
me about Logan. Even
Yes.
when I was at the Arkansas hospice event down in Argenta, Simone was introducing me to another lady, and she asked me, "Tell me about your son." And at that moment, I was overwhelmed.
Mhm.
Tears started running down my face. I took a few deep
Yeah.
breaths, and I leaned in, and I could eventually tell her about Logan. And
Mhm.
so oftentimes, and it wasn't that she was trying to fix anything, she just wanted to know Logan's story. And
Yeah.
all too often, I think that friends of grieving parents, or anyone that's grieving, feels like they have to fix the problem. And it's not
Yes.
fixing that we want. It's just being present.
Yes.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. And people are reluctant or reticent to ask because, again, kind of the way that the messages that we've been given is that we don't want to upset anyone, or and then we're
Right.
at when
They're
the
afraid they'll get the response that you had, Doug.
yeah, and then they don't know what to do with that. So,
Right.
but in
yes.
reality, the beauty of that, and the beauty of not only that person wanted to know, but you responded with such a genuine, heartfelt, the tears came, because it's like, here's an opportunity to tell my son's story. And we talk about this all the time: as long as you say my name, I'll live forever. So, keeping the stories alive, but people don't know what to do. And that's where the kind of the catch 22 is, because there's nothing to do. It's the being. And that's why education about grief, I think, is so paramount and so needed.
And it doesn't happen until it's needed. And that
Right.
is unfortunate.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yep.
some of them, did you want to add anything, Simone?
No,
Okay.
I'm good. Thank
Some
you.
of the things that we talk about is some of the myths around grief. Like, Time heals all wounds. You should move on. At least they're in a better place. I'll tell you what, those things, when people say them to me, make me angry.
They
Um,
do. They do. Yes. And I we call those platitudes. And usually I would say they come from a good intention
yes.
of the person saying it, but they're also trying to just fill space and trying to make you feel better. When in reality, it's doing exactly the opposite of that. So, like the time heals all wounds, well, I believe that in time, your grief will not be as acute as it is right now, and that it will soften a bit, and that the things that are so very difficult in the beginning are not as difficult later on, simply because you've learned to live with this grief and you have tools, but it doesn't mean that it's ever healed, right?
Right.
Grief is always with you and it will be with you forever. That's a part of your story. You've just dealt with it different over time. The same about like moving on. It's time for you to move on, or you should move on. Maybe someone has lost a spouse and people are like, you need to go date or whatever it is. I prefer to say living forward.
Yes.
People are meant to live forward and engage in life. However, that also takes time, and people will do those things when they're ready, not when they're told you should move on. And so all of those things, I do believe they usually come from a heartfelt place, just trying to make you comfort,
I agree.
comfortable or whatever. But I think if we could do more education around these things, people would probably be better off just to put a hand on a shoulder, or
Mhm.
just to be there, or just to say, I'm so sorry, and just leave it at that, instead of trying to add the comfort things to
Right.
it.
Right.
Because then that becomes holding space instead of hurtful to the person who's grieving.
Right. I agree. And how do you explain the difference between grief and trauma, especially in something like a sudden loss of an overdose or fentanyl poisoning?
Yeah. Jamie, am I hogging things, or do you want me to take it?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, take that, and then I'll add a couple of
Okay.
things. But yes,
Okay.
please.
So traumatic grief is when someone experiences grief and trauma at the same time, simultaneously. And so the trauma might become from an accident, an overdose, like in Logan's case, violence, a car, like unexpected, and there is trauma with it. And so traumatic grief, when those come together, can people cope? Absolutely. But it also increases, um, or might interfere with the normal grieving process, because they have to deal with the trauma part as well. And so, like in children especially, it might impact them, socially, cognitively, obviously emotionally. For lots of us, it can bring post-traumatic stress disorder, or other major depressive disorders. It can, um, create anxiety, because we have this fear of what just happened to our loved person. And, so there's just a lot of things that can come with trauma that adds to the grief. And so that's where we would call it traumatic grief. And they are two separate things to be dealt with.
They
They
most
they
certainly
are.
are.
And in the 10 years that I worked in traumatic death, the conversations that I would have with people, and um, I want to back up just a second when you're talking about the way the world perceives grief, and what we were just talking about it a minute ago, and how people tend to minimize grief. And Simone and I laugh a lot because we talk about when people try and steal your grief, when instead of you being able to share your story, all of a sudden they have to share their story, and their story is bigger, and you end up having to comfort them. So that's another way where we kind of go a little bit off the rails. But I heard a sentence one time that said, well, I heard a quote that said, no helpful sentence ever begins with the words "at least."
Right.
As in, at least you can have other children, or at least you still have two children, or at least your husband
Brene
didn't
Brown says that.
Yeah, and I think about that, but I just wanted to chime in with that before. But a lot of the conversations that I had with people when they had experienced traumatic death, literally their son was sitting beside them for dinner, and then they get a phone call 2 hours later. I can remember working with people, one woman especially, who had an argument with her son, and he left the house in anger on his motorcycle and was in a wreck and suffered a traumatic brain injury. And her guilt, and her regret. So a lot of feelings that are often have to do with anger and regret and grief, and guilt. Things like kind of the magical thinking of, well, if we had just stood in the kitchen and talked for 2 more minutes, then that person that hit my daughter wouldn't have been at that light. Or, so there's a lot of kind of working through. I've always said that if is the biggest word in the English language, because it's one of the ways that we try and wrap ourselves around what happened and what could have happened differently. And so the trauma and the navigating all the ways that someone may feel because of what happened rides shotgun with the grief over what happened, if that makes sense to differentiate those two.
Absolutely, it does. Absolutely. And that kind of leads to why most bereaved parents feel so isolated or judged, and why they can't speak the truth about what's going on.
I've just been waiting for my dog to bark, so we're good.
Well, my dog is being good. So what can communities do better in supporting people that are going through traumatic grief?
Well, I would say, for one, the grief of this kind, and we're talking specifically, today about losing a child to substance use or drug poisoning. And lots of times that is what we call a disenfranchised grief, where for some reason it's not recognized in the way that it would be. There's a stigma around it, right? Because the person was using either illegal substances or abusing prescription drugs or something like that. And maybe the bereaved person, like you, Dad, maybe you've dealt with the addiction of, seeing this happen and trying so hard to make a course correction, like the death feels avoidable, but then society may issue blame or judgment or shame, and you take those on. You have guilt, like, of thinking, I could have prevented this, or why couldn't we have prevented this? But I would say that the idea that communities, if we could just quit shaming people in so many ways, like, wouldn't life be better, right?
Stigma is one of the things that I speak a lot about in my podcast, in my public speaking with other grieving parents, because oftentimes it's not only the child that's gone or the loved one that's gone from an overdose or a fentanyl poisoning. It sometimes other family members are in active addiction. So the whole grieving process is complicated even more by that. And the stigma surrounding that. And the only thing that I've been able to noodle through about stigma is that it all boils back to, as a society, we don't do enough to protect mental wellness in people. We don't focus. I know insurance companies don't really care about mental wellness because they can't throw a pill at it. And I think that if we worked harder as a community to support each other in our mental wellness, give space for people to have their own opinion, then we might get through this better as a group. What does that make sense?
Yeah, Doug, I think you're walking alongside grieving people who have lost someone to this cause of death, and so you probably understand it just as well or better than we do.
Yeah. Well, and you've both heard me say it before. I don't think anybody can be an expert in another person's grief and another person's, journey. So you have an inside track, as it were, to grief in a way that neither Simone or I can really speak to. We can speak all day long about aspects of grief and things that we can do and ways to support and ways to educate, but really having the knowing in your bones, Doug, and that's why I think that is such a lovely thing that you're doing, to take up the cause and to take up the mantle, because not only are you doing this in honor and in memory of Logan, but you are, how do I say this? You are telling his story and reframing the narrative of his life in a way that Simone and I could not do. And I think, I want to say another thing about when, especially when a child dies. And now a child can be 2 years old or a child can be 30 years old. But I think one of the things too that parents struggle with is, not only the narrative of their life, but the narrative of what never gets to come. Marriage,
Absolutely.
children, grandchildren, graduating from school, all those kind of things that we place when we think about our children and the hopes and the dreams and the aspirations. There is grief in that. We talk a lot about primary loss and secondary loss, and some of those secondary losses are, the loss of dreams, the loss of hope, the loss of that can sometimes, depending on the circumstances, be just as painful, if not more so, than the actual loss itself.
An altered future is
An
how I
altered
refer
future.
to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's exactly right.
That's a good term.
So
it is.
what do you ladies do to protect your own hearts as grief supporters? And what have you learned from people you've walked through loss with?
Jamie, you want to take it?
Yeah. Well, I'll start. And in self-care, and our director, Barbara Voss, is such an advocate of self-care. And, you hear phrases like you can't pour from an empty vessel, which is true. But one of the things, and I say this to grieving people, and I do, and in all honesty, I say things to grieving people that I don't sometimes give myself the same grace, but I'm a big believer in surrounding yourself with people who nurture you and not starve you. So, are you, looking at are you adding to your life, or are the things that you're doing, are they creating a deficit? And, doing the kind of work that we do, and even that you're doing, Doug, is, it does beat up the heart, and that makes a heart tender, but there has to be a measure of protection. I talk to people all the time that they may sound like my dad, or they may remind me of my mother or my sister, whatever it is. And what I have learned through the years is, to compartmentalize is really important, and finding the balance between staying present with someone, even if I may be feeling a certain way, to be able to continue to be present with someone, and also at the same time recognize this is something that I need to tuck away and pay attention to and take it out and examine it and hold it to the light and process it in whatever way is most beneficial for me, at an appropriate time that is safe and comfortable, and will help me be able to continue to be present, and not taking anything away from the person that I'm speaking with in the moment. Because again, the goal is never for those that we are companioning to have to take care of us. So, and it's taken time to learn how to do that, and I don't do it perfectly, but I do recognize that if I don't take care of myself, um, how can I keep showing up for other people?
Absolutely. I think one of my biggest issues is setting boundaries, because
Yes.
I will give everything in my heart away just to hug somebody, and then there's no hugs left for myself. So
Yes.
that's
You're
something I
you're a piece of
struggle with.
toast. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Simone, I know
And
you've got good thoughts about this.
oh, well,
Please share. Yeah.
but I would say, especially about the people that we encounter, is that we continue to see the human strength of resilience.
Yes.
And people do not know how strong they are until they are in the situation. And I know they feel so weak, but then we continue to get to see them strengthen as they go along and become resilient. And I would say that, as a grief supporter, I also tap into that resilience. My heart maybe is made for this work. I mean, I think that we are attracted to this calling, because that's where our hearts are. And so maybe my heart has something a little bit different
Yeah.
about it that allows me to provide grief support in the ways that we do. But I totally agree with Jamie about compartmentalizing. I remember in my very early days, I was an apprentice funeral director, and we had a funeral of two sisters, little girls, and I lost it. Like I just totally lost it. And my boss said to me at that time, "Go ahead and go home. You're not of help to me right now." And while that was so difficult, it was such a pivotal point in what am I doing here? My goal is to help people. And so I have to learn how to stay in control and, like Jamie said, compartmentalize and deal with other things later. But I need to be the strongest person in the room at that time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we do play and we play hard, and we do a lot of self-care, and we do a lot of laughter, and we do cry
Yes.
when we need to, and we do all those things. And so, and we do set boundaries, Doug. My phone goes off at 8 p.m., but I also don't give grieving people my personal phone number. And while that may sound kind of, weird sometimes, like, I also know how I need to protect my own space and my own energy and things like that. So
Because you can't
I
pour from an empty vessel.
that is
That's right.
right. Yeah.
I remember I was in a social situation one night. I was at an event um, one evening, and a woman that who was a friend, socially was a friend, who had experienced a loss. And she came up to me. She was at that event as well. And she came up to me and began talking about this loss, and was basically wanting to kind of have a little session. And this was difficult for me because but I've had to learn how to set boundaries. But I said to her, let's find a time where we can talk. That I said, because I'm off the clock right now, and I'm with my spouse, and I'm enjoying myself. And I tried to frame it in a way that was I want to be the best person that I can for you. But I also had a little bit of resentment going on too. It's like, hey, I'm off the clock. But I also recognize that sometimes when people who are grieving, their filter is what they're experiencing in the moment. And I get that. But boundary setting is enormous. And that is something I get to practice a lot and learn, and learning how to set really good, healthy boundaries. But I will also say this. Ritual is an important part of self-care for me as well. Depending on the situation, and especially when I just feel like I've just kind of had the what beat out of me. My heart is just feeling bruised, and my body feels like it's tired and achy, and I know that I've given a lot of myself. So I look to ritual. What is it that I can do to recalibrate myself, to kind of bring myself back to center? Do I need a bath? Do I need a walk? Do I need a prayer? Do I need to sit with a candle or music? Do I need to read a book? Do I need to go down a TikTok rabbit hole and laugh till I have tears in my eyes?
TikTok ritual.
I'm telling you, TikTok ritual is a real thing, because at 3:00 in the morning, when I'm looking at two cats having a conversation with each other because somebody's been clever enough to do a voiceover, and I have tears running down my face because I'm laughing so hard. Believe me, that is self-care.
I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do want to circle back around to setting boundaries. That's something that we work with grieving people to do as well,
Yes.
because they are so raw and so vulnerable, and everybody is trying to help them to feel better and suggesting things they should do, to get to that place. And we really encourage boundary setting for the grieving person. Yeah, go to that invitation, but set a boundary. I can only stay an hour. Or set a boundary that I will try, but if I have to leave, then please understand that. Or set a boundary with your children that you cannot call me every single day, 3 times a day, to check on me. I'm okay. Things like that. I mean, it can be such a variety of boundary setting, but grieving people need to know that they have permission to set boundaries, and what sort of boundaries will help them through this.
Absolutely, I
Yes.
agree with that.
Well, and two, because and the permission is a huge part of that, but
Yeah.
also,
permission.
again, because it never, I don't think I don't think it occurs to a grieving person, and I say this a lot, and God loves Simone, she could probably speak for me at any given time about, but that no is a complete sentence.
Yep.
I don't know is a complete sentence. And here's the biggest mind-blowing concept of all: we can change our minds. And so if somebody is calling and wanting us to come to dinner because it'll do you good, get out, be with friends, whatever, it's okay to say, I'm so happy. Thank you for reaching out to me. I'm going to say no right now because this is the way I feel. But a week from now, when you're having dinner, I may be in a better space, and I may change my mind, and I may say, hey, I think I've decided to join you after all. So, because as we know, grief is fluid, and, we don't ever know on any given day what we're going to be feeling like. But the concept of boundary setting is so foreign that it doesn't occur to people that they have a right to that. And that's part of the support that we provide. And it's revolutionary to people, and it's revelatory, because there's like, well, it never occurred to me that I don't have to get those thank you cards out within the first week, that I have permission to wait another week or another month or whatever it is. So boundary setting is for self-care, yes, but it's also essential for the grieving person.
Absolutely, I agree with that. What's some more advice you might give someone who wants to support a grieving friend but afraid they're going to say the wrong thing?
Say it anyway. Encourage them to say, well, okay, I'm going to back up against that. Let me back up a little bit, but
you know what
again,
I'm thinking.
I know. So yeah, and people are well intentioned, but we say this a lot. The goal is to meet people where they are, and to not project our agenda onto anyone. I may have a need for a grieving person to go out to dinner with me because ultimately that's going to make me feel better. So, so the concept that what we're doing and what we're giving is all for the best of the grieving person. So it's like getting ourselves out of the way, getting rid of an agenda. So, asking them what they need. And if they don't know what they need, it's okay, I think, to make suggestions. Can I bring you food? Can I run an errand for you? Can I take your dog to the vet? Can I sit with your husband while you go and get a manicure? Can I do laundry for you? If any of those things, just, take a gift certificate. I mean, just, I think, and being present and, asking about the person who's gone. I think that's that's at the top of the list.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Here's one of the things I would say: if you're wanting to support your grieving friend, maybe take a quick self-inventory of what you might be able to do for them. Are you a doer? So if you're the doer, and do something. Like Jamie said, she mentioned several things that you could do for that grieving person. And it might be that you just have to say, I am going to come get your laundry and take care of it today, instead of, can I do your laundry?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Because lots of times the person, the offer is being made to, they're like, oh, thank you. But, and sometimes you just need to just do, or are you a listener? Are you the person who can sit with them in their uncomfortableness and let them talk and just say what they need to do? Or, for you to be able to prompt them to talk about the person who died or whatever. So are you a doer? Are you a listener? Or are you maybe a respite person? Are you the person that gets them out and away from reality, for lack of a better word, like gets them to actually laugh again, take them to do something fun, that sort of thing. So, but I agree with what Jamie said. Like, don't be afraid to say the wrong thing if it comes from the heart, but don't feel the need to say anything either.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's just being.
Yeah. There's I'm a big fan of Father Henry now, and who was a Catholic theologian, and one of his books, The Wounded Healer, talks about the ability to be present with people, and he says that he said, being present with people, not fixing, not curing, is the biggest gift that we can give one another.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
If there's one thing you wish every grieving person knew, what would that be?
That they have a right.
Hurt so bad.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even though they don't believe,
but it's not going to be this intense always. Most people, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Jamie.
That's okay.
Most people immediately, they're like, I don't even want to live anymore. I mean, that's a very common response. Or I don't care if I died tomorrow. Like, they may not be suicidal, but we do have people sometimes that are in that state. But passively, like, they're like, whatever, I just don't care about anything. They won't always feel that way.
I know the anticipation is overwhelming sometimes. Just the anticipation of having Logan's car transported up here. Y'all remember
I remember that. I
was going through. It was overwhelming for me. It got here, and I was like, really? I was worried about that.
Yeah.
Well, that's real common too. The projection of how we think we're going to feel in, at any certain way about something.
I think one thing to remember is that although we have all experienced grief at different times in our life, each death is going to bring different things. We are going to grieve differently based on the relationship, based on the circumstances, based on timing, based on where we are in life. Like there's so many factors that are going to affect our grief. And so while we might say, I grieved well when my mom died, like I felt like things were healthy. I got through it. Yes, I was sad. But then along comes a child and it is an entirely different experience for you.
Entirely.
And yeah. And so the thing I would want you to know is that all the things that you are feeling are valid, and that there will be a day that you will laugh again and that you will continue to live forward. You're stronger than you think.
And sometimes laughter comes from tears.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think that people don't believe us when we say it will not always hurt this badly. And they'll say, I don't believe that right now, but I'm going to trust that. And Doug, you are proof. And it's not that you don't miss and love your son and you don't grieve your son, but if 5 years ago, if we would have said, look at where you're going to be in 5 years, you would not have believed us.
Not even a little bit.
No, and you would not have wanted to believe us, because sometimes the depth of our grief is we need that proof. We need that mantle of, I'm grieving this deeply because I love this deeply. But also, I think to answer the question that you asked, a person has a right to their grief in whatever way is most beneficial for them. And these are conversations that we have a lot. I spoke with a gentleman the other day. He said, I'm going, and these are early days in his loss, going to the cemetery every day. Is that weird? Or not going to the cemetery at all? Or I don't want to go to the restaurant where I ate with my wife once a week after church anymore. Or I don't want to sit in the same pew. Or I sleep with her nightgown because it smells like her, whatever it is. And these are real stories that we hear, that grief is singular and there's no time frame and there's no roadmap. There is only the way that an individual is experiencing it, and they have a right to that experience in the way that is best for them. And, even when all the voices are in their ears saying, Mom, it's been a month. Don't you want to go back to church? Or, oh, come on, you need to eat a little bit, whatever. Yes, we do want people to reinvest and reengage in the world and get their nutrition and get their hydration and surround themselves with supported people. But it looks so different for everyone that I think there is such relief when we say to people and we give them permission, you have a right to take this journey in the way that is best for you.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, what brings you hope in the work that you do?
Can I back up just a minute,
Absolutely.
Doug?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. There is one more thing I would want grieving people to know.
Okay.
If you are familiar with the 5 stages of grief, which most people are, I would say, and I continue to say, throw those out the window.
Yes,
they were
please.
Very well intentioned and thought out and written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for people who are dying, but it was, as Jamie calls it, hijacked, and just applied generally to grieving people. And when we think that we have stages that we're going to adhere to, then when we experience, let's say, anger, and we feel like we are finished with that, and we go on to other things, and then anger comes back around again, we're like, what the heck? I'm grieving wrong.
Yeah, I've done
Something's
something
wrong
wrong.
with me.
I've
Yeah.
regressed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And we are doing
that's
so many things at so many times. There are other grief theories, if anybody is interested in dual process of mourning or dual process of grief and 4 stages, 4 tasks of mourning. I'm getting all mixed up. But I just want you to know, like, it's not going to come in stages. It's going to come as it needs to come. And so just give yourself grace. And then I also wanted to piggyback on your laughter, Doug. Sometimes the laughter coming out of the tears. I immediately, when you said that, flashback to the movie Steel Magnolias.
Oh yeah.
And the
Yes.
scene at the cemetery where the mom, I can't remember her name, is
Malin.
She is so mad and angry and expressing all the emotions, and her friends are there not knowing what to do, and some of them are giving platitudes and things like that. So it's such a great scene for so many things. And then they all end up just laughing, you know? And so with the right supports and the right permissions, those things can happen.
Absolutely. What
Yeah.
brings you hope in the work that you two do?
People like you, Doug.
That was exactly what I was going to say. People like you, Doug. People like you who are unbelievable, inspiring examples of a willingness to trust people like us who are supporting you, trusting the process. And you've got all the language now, you've got all the vernacular, words like embracing, leaning in. You are such an example of finding the balance between still grieving, always grieving on some level, but and I think about a line from the movie Castaway when Tom Hanks, has been found, and he comes back and he says, "And the sun will rise tomorrow." And but the willingness to get up and to keep leaning in and to let those feelings wash over you, and to trust and to know that you're right where you're supposed to be. And then when it's time for you to be somewhere else, you will turn the corner into the next feeling, and trusting and believing that grief is doing what grief is supposed to do.
I I think I can't thank you guys enough. Um,
Simone,
you're
chime in on that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, anytime that we know that people are able to continue to get up and maybe brush their teeth is the big task of the day, but they're able to do that. And then, in a week, they're able to do something else. And it just continues, like we see them one step at a time. Sometimes the step is backwards, but that's okay because that obviously is what's supposed to happen. But as we see people go from completely broken to engaging in life again is what gives us hope.
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's kind of what does it for me. I just can't thank you both enough, Jamie and Simone. Not just thank you for supporting me, but for joining me on Logan's Voice today.
It's an honor.
It is. I remember, Doug, as we would sit on Zoom and Logan was over your shoulder in the
Yes.
picture behind you,
He
and
still
he was part
is.
of it. Yes.
He still is.
Yeah.
It's all about the compassion and steady presence that you both offered when I was drowning in grief.
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
Yeah.
You were always there in those quiet moments when I didn't have words. I'm getting choked up now, but
And
that's okay.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Well, I am too a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the tears come without
I've got
warning.
tears in my eyes, Doug.
But
Yeah.
there is a smile on my face.
Yes, you always have said that. You have always said that.
You
And I
helped
think
me and so many others take that first step into grief journey. And I learned how to lean into it from you. Um, you reminded us that it's okay to not be okay and that there's no timeline for healing. And that even
right.
through a screen, love and empathy can reach us. So Zoom support groups, I think, are a valid platform.
Thank you for saying that.
Yes.
You made the unbearable feel a little less lonely. And to everyone listening, if you're just beginning this journey or if you're years into it and still searching for footing, please know there are people out there like Jamie and Simone, people who won't try to fix you, but who will sit with you in the mess of it all and help you learn to breathe again. We all need that kind of support, and I will always, always be grateful that I found it when I did.
Well,
Thank you
thank
both.
you so much, Doug. We are honored to be here today, and we
Yes.
do love you.
I love
Yes,
y'all.
we do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
And I will talk to y'all later. Again, it is my honor to have been joined by these two amazing women today. Until next time, visit logansvoice.com. There's a swag shop. There is access to the book, Logan's Story, and more links to other podcasts that I've done. Until later, be kind to one another. I am Logan's voice. I am Logan's dad. And I will not be silent any longer.